aristocratic slaveholding class that was built upon it. They were the ones who led the South into the era of rebellion. Slavery, in their view, had perverted Republican principles in the South by creating a permanently subjugated labor force without opportunity to rise. And by building upon that, an aristocratic, anti-democratic class of slaveholders. Reconstruction, therefore, must destroy slavery and therefore remove all of the foundations for rebellion. International Reconstruction involved the projection of America's demonstrated power, military power, but also moral power within the Western Hemisphere and Europe. And that's what I'm going to talk about from this point forward. Now, you have to remember that at the end of the war, 1865, America was surrounded by adversaries, if not enemies. Of course, beginning with the Confederacy, which was in rebellion against the fundamental principles of democracy, equality of human beings, and the acceptance of majority rule, and of free and fair elections. At the heart of the rebellion was a refusal to accept the outcome of the 1860 election. Imagine that. The war taught America that European imperialists were the enemies of American republicanism. They came in and took advantage of the war to reassert their influence in Latin America, to recolonize, or at least to subjugate their former empire, their former colonies in Latin America. So on the southern border, in addition to the Confederacy, you had Mexico that had now been occupied by the French army and had a European prince installed as their monarch, Maximilian, the Austrian Habsburg Emperor of Mexico, as he called himself now. Now, Napoleon didn't want to just take over Mexico. Mexico was to be the hegemonic center of an empire that would dominate the Latin race, as they called it, in the New World. The French would lead the Latin race in Europe, and Maximilian and Mexico, under French tutelage and protection, would lead the Latin race out of degeneration into leadership in Latin America. The grand design, they call it. Now, to the north lay two other European empires, Russia, in what we now call Alaska, Russia and America, and Britain, in what we now call Canada. Britain had proven adversarial toward the Union. You all know the story about the Trent Affair, where they built a Confederate, they almost went to war with America over the capture of two Confederate envoys who were captured on the battleship Trent. And then they built Confederate raiders, the CSS Alabama, and many other ships that preyed on American shippers during the war. Britain also harbored Confederate terrorists in Montreal, people who plotted what could only be called terrorism, especially around the 1864 election, to try to break the will and demoralize the Union. One group came into New York City, rented hotel rooms, and set fires to the hotel rooms, hoping to start a general confrontation that would panic New Yorkers. They also raided St. Albans, Vermont, a little railroad town, robbed a bank, shot up to the town, set fire to buildings, and killed a couple people, made their way back to Montreal, and the British authorities there would not extradite them, even let them keep the money that they robbed from the bank. It was an outrage. Spain, for its part, was the first to take advantage of the Civil War. It swept into the Dominican Republic, its former colony, and declared that it was now a new part of the Spanish Empire. Then it joined France and Britain for the Allied invasion of Mexico, eventually withdrawn. But soon after it withdrew from Mexico, they sent a fleet of warships into Peru and Chile to provoke wars there apparently with the effort to subjugate them and to reassert Spanish authority in the New World. And then in March 1867, one by one, within a matter of days, all of these empires withdrew from the Western Hemisphere. For some reason, the historians have never put this together, but you can just see, as I began to think about these together. March 12th, or I think it was the 18th, I can't remember, the French march out of Mexico and board ships in Veracruz. Russia signs a treaty to sell Alaska to the United States. And at the same time, the same day, Queen Victoria signs the British North America Act, creating what they call the Dominion of Canada. Okay, it's not a republic, it's not an independent nation, but it's no longer a colony. It's kind of a home rule colony. And as the British at the Times explained, it'll be much more like your government than ours. Spain agreed one day later on April 1st to come into negotiation and let the United States mediate a peace over its wars in South America. And in effect, it brought its fleet home. Now, underlying this international reconstruction was a familiar old document called the Monroe Doctrine. Written in 1823, it was to warn European empires against further colonization of the New World. Now the doctrine is revived and it becomes a more aggressive kind of pro-Republican, small r, pro-Republican democratic doctrine. This is unofficial, not a State Department or a presidential decision. But it means that the Monroe Doctrine argues that the Americas, the American hemisphere, is going to be the haven of republics, and that imperialist empires, monarchies, are its inherent enemies, and they will do all they can to destroy us. And at the same time, there was what they call the Seward corollary, that slave regimes are also inimical to republics. Slavery must end, Seward argued. He told the French, who were trying to revive slavery, that is the Maximilian, and he told Spain that slavery was on its way out. Now Seward, you probably know, was a New Yorker, governor of New York, and he, what I think was a brilliant Secretary of State under Lincoln and then under Johnson. He's gotten a bad rap for his service to Andrew Johnson, but he was a very skillful master of statecraft. He was also strongly anti-slavery. In April 1862, months before the Emancipation Proclamation, Seward signed a treaty with Britain to cooperate with them in ending the transatlantic slave trade. Before, when the South had representation in Congress, you couldn't touch that. You couldn't do it. And most of the slave trade that continued into the 1860s was done with American flags, ships bearing the American flag, but they were protected by war slavery in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Brazil, where it still survived, the last strongholds. Once the Union won, that is. Now, in addition to repulsing European imperialism from America, which happened very quickly and rapidly and almost magically in 1867, and in addition to extinguishing slavery, or at least putting slavery on the road to extinction in the Spanish Empire and Brazil, in Europe, there was also a wave of reforms and revolutions that helped to democratize Europe. Britain was the first to lead off. As soon as the war was coming to an end, you could just see the pro-union element that had been kind of exercising its democratic right of speech and its rhetoric, pro-democracy began to meet. And the meetings in support of Lincoln when he was assassinated became kind of rival movements for democratic reform in Britain. workers began comparing themselves to slaves in America. Britain was the freest in Europe in many ways, well, Switzerland or so, but it was also the most democratic. Only one in adult males. That's not the worst part. So skewed, the districts were so gerrymandered that a small group of families, aristocratic landed families, controlled most of the seats in Parliament. The urban industrial population, the working class, was pretty much left out, had no voice in Parliament. Now, Karl Marx plays a surprising role in my book. He was a real champion of democratic reform at this time, and a champion also of what we call democratic socialism. He loved Lincoln, he admired Lincoln. He couldn't believe that Lincoln, with the stroke of a pen, could emancipate 4 million enslaved workers in America. He had organized late in 1864, around the time of the re-election of Lincoln, the International Working Men's Association, the IWMA, but known among communists everywhere as the First International. And it immediately took sides with the Union. He wrote a wonderful letter to Lincoln, extolling him as the single-minded son of the working class, who would lead his country through matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world. Karl Marx in 1864. Marx and others saw in Lincoln great potential for what he called revolutionary democracy. Workers must, he told them, conquer political power. Don't just strike to get higher wages. You need to get power in Parliament to change the government and to reform it. The First International organized the Reform League, and because they couldn't vote, what they did was march in the streets, demonstrate. They had massive demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of people turned out and gathered in Trafalgar Square. And then they decided they would move on to Hyde Park and have a big rally there. At one point, the police tried to stop them, and they gathered around the iron rails outside the park, leaned on them, broke them down, and rushed into the park and gave speeches. That's what they wanted to do, not to have a mob riot. That corner of Hyde Park by the Marble Arch now goes by the name of Speaker's Corner, set aside for the rights of freeborn Englishmen to speak their mind. All throughout the Reform League's movement, America was the touchstone, the model for democracy, for workers' emancipation. They would go down Pall Mall Street, which is lined with the gentlemen's clubs, and they would hoot and jeer at the Tory clubs and cheer the Reform Club, which was for Gladstone and the Liberal Party. They would sing American Civil War songs and toast Lincoln. Behind the windows of those gentlemen's clubs, the Tories were kind of looking out in fear, and there was indeed great fear that Britain might be on the verge of some kind of revolutionary upheaval. There were other activities I could talk about later. And this was emboldening for the Liberal Party, or at least the liberal side of the Liberal Party, the radical party, the faction of the Liberal Party. John Stuart Mill, MP, was really galvanized by the Civil War, and he came up from Avignon, where he'd been mourning his wife for years after she died, and stood for Parliament. And he got up in 1864 when they were discussing, not 64 but 66, when they were discussing suffrage reform, and said, I asked that you change the word male to persons. There is no reason why women cannot be eligible to vote as well as men. It set off a spark in Britain. Dozens of suffrage movements were organized. Today is Suffrage Day in the United States. I'm honoring that with my white coat here. And there was a kind of Anglo-American suffrage movement. The idea came before, but the movement was born. Britain's cautious embrace of democracy was the first of many in 1867. I'm going to finish soon. It was, one diplomat said, fruit from the Appomattox apple tree. Let me just finish briefly with an allusion to what comes afterward. I talked about revolutions in Spain and an interesting chapter on the fall of Rome and Pope Pius IX. And then, of course, this came undone. And this is the least happy chapter in my book. But by the 1890s, not only was domestic Reconstruction undone with new laws, the Mississippi Constitution, which effectively took away the vote, not by a racial blanket against voting, but by the understanding clause literacy. And at the same time, the same decade, America's tradition of anti-imperialism, pro-democracy of the 1860s became an imperialist movement justified by Rudyard Kipling's famous poem that America must take up the white man's burden in the Philippines and in Latin America. The language, the principles of democracy, and the threat of racism and nativism to those principles of Reconstruction, domestic, international, us today, don't they? Again, this nation, and any nation so conceived, as Lincoln said, faces grave tests on whether they will defend or betray Lincoln's promise of a new birth of freedom.